Hi there, I'm Lou.
And I'm Lee.
And this is Uncovering History. Hello everyone and welcome to our fifth podcast. Today we are going to be looking at someone called Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad for short, and I'm going to hand you over to Lee, who's been doing lots of research on him.
Hi everyone, so today we're going to be looking at Vlad the Impaler. So as usual, we'll start off with some background information about him and then we'll move on into his life. So Vlad the Impaler was born around 1431 in Siazora, Transylvania, which was at that time a part of the Kingdom of Hungary. Centuries on, his birthplace Wallachia adopted the name we know today as Romania in 1866. There are, however, disputes about his exact birth date. However, at this point, many agree that his birth year was 1431. So Vlad was the Prince of Wallachia, where he ruled on three different occasions, in 1448, 1456 to 1462, and 1476. We'll discuss this timeline in more detail as we move through this episode. So now that we've covered some base information about his birth, we'll move on to some information about his known aliases and a little segment on his father. So, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, Dracula, Dracula or Dracula are some of his known names given to this man. However, the final two were names that he used himself to sign off letters only.
So he was known as Dracula then?
Yeah, so he had a number of names, but the most common one that most people will recognise is Dracula.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so it is unknown who the mother of Vlad was. However, his father was Vlad Dracul, which means Vlad the Dragon in Old Romanian. He was given this name when he was entered into the Order of the Dragon, which usually contained noblemen or people of power. It was a militant fraternity founded by Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund and was dedicated to halting the advance of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. Now, going back to the names noted above, Dracula and Dracula, which Vlad the Impaler often used, derived meanings of the son of the dragon, and in modern Romanian, Dracul means the devil, which has contributed to Vlad's reputation greatly.
So I guess here, just his name basically is associated or synonymous with the devil, which, that gives me a little bit of an idea of what this character is going to be like.
Yeah, he's not the most savoury of characters. So now that we've discussed that, we'll move on to his early life. Now, he was the second son to his father, who became the ruler of Wallachia in 1436. His father seized control of Wallachia after the death of his half-brother, Alexander I of Aldea. Vlad was known to have two brothers and a potential illegitimate third brother called Vlad the Monk, who was born somewhere between 1425 to 1430. Now, unfortunately, there isn't much information on Vlad the Monk, and as such, his knowledge is limited. So one of his father's charters, which he issued on the 20th of January 1437, preserves the first reference to Vlad III, or Vlad the Impaler, and his elderly brother Messiah, both of which were mentioned as his firstborn sons. They were mentioned in a further 4 documents noted around this time period, the final of which noted their younger brother Radu also. Now, during this time, there was a lot of military conflict between the rising Ottoman Empire and the Hungarian, Polish and Wallachian armies. After a meeting with John Hunyadi, voivode of Transylvania at the time, which typically means a local governor or ruler in Central or Eastern Europe, Vlad Dracul did not support an Ottoman invasion of Transylvania in March 1442, creating conflict. The Ottoman Sultan, Murad II, subsequently ordered Vlad Dracul to come to Gallipoli to demonstrate his loyalty. Vlad III and Radu accompanied their father to the Ottoman Empire, where they were all imprisoned. Vlad Dracul was released before the end of the year. However, Vlad and Radu were kept hostage to ensure their father's loyalty. During this time, their lives were in grave danger, as the father had clearly shown support for Vladislav, King of Poland and Hungary, during the Crusade of Varna in 1444, instead of support for the Sultan. It should also be noted that during these days they were subjected to torturous acts and bouts of violence. And at this point, Vlad Dracul was convinced that his two sons had been butchered for the sake of Christian peace, but this was not the case. Neither Vlad nor Radu was murdered or mutilated after their father's clear rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. A few years on, Vlad Dracul once again acknowledged allegiance to the Sultan and promised to pay a yearly tribute to him in 1446. John Hyundi, who had since become the regent governor of Hungary in 1446, broke into Wallachia in November 1447. By this point, it had been noted that Vlad and Radu had fled the Ottoman Empire, which suggested that the Sultan had allowed them to return to Wallachia after their father paid homage to him. Now Vlad Dracul and his eldest son, Mircea, were murdered as a result. Hunyadi made Vladislav II the ruler of Wallachia. Now I can appreciate this is a lot of information to digest, but it was important to establish a basis for his early life and the actions that his father chose to take, which resulted in his untimely death.
Yeah, there is a lot of names going on here, and obviously we're talking about something that's happened a long, long time ago. So yeah, I can see that it's going to get a little bit complicated. So do you want to carry on?
Yeah, so I'll carry on and I'll do my best to make sense of things where I can. So, upon the death of his father and elder brother, Vlad became a potential successor to Wallachia. Now Vladislav II of Wallachia accompanied John Hunyadi, who launched a campaign against the Ottoman Empire in September 1448. Taking advantage of his opponent's absence, Vlad broke into Wallachia at the head of an Ottoman Empire army in early October 1448. The Ottomans subsequently defeated Hunyadi's army in the famous Battle of Kosovo between the 17th and 18th of August. Hunyadi's deputy urged Vlad to meet him in Transylvania, however he denied such a request. As Vladislav II returned with the remaining army that he still had by his side, Vlad was forced to flee to the Ottoman Empire around the 7th of December 1448. So this was his first attempt at taking power, but the little forces that remained in the city were enough to push Vlad back on this occasion.
So it was unsuccessful.
Absolutely unsuccessful. And it's at this point that Vlad experiences his first period of exile, in which case he settled in Edirne in the Ottoman Empire before moving to Moldavia, where Bogdan II had mounted the throne with John Hunyadi's support in the autumn of 1449. Now today we know Moldavia as Moldova.
I'm really glad you clarified that, because for a moment I thought you were just mispronouncing that country's name.
No. So after Bogdan II was murdered in October 1451, Bogdan's son, Stephen, and Vlad fled to Transylvania to seek assistance from Hunyadi. Now Hunyadi, bear in mind before, is the one that Vlad was trying to overthrow. So we're already starting to see a picture now with Vlad settling with the Ottoman army, and then with Hunyadi, he'll kind of settle with whomever he believes will give him the most power or chance of success.
So he's got one of those complexes where, you know, whoever's got the most power, you kind of gravitate towards.
He likes control and he likes power, yeah. And we can see at this point that this is a recurring trend, that Vlad always ends up where he deems to be safe, irrespective of the side that it favours. Now during this time, Hunyadi concluded a 3-year truce with the Ottoman Empire on the 20th of November 1451. He also noted that the Wallachian boyars, or aristocrats, had the right to elect the successor of Vladislav II should he die. We now move on a few years to 1456 and Vlad's second ruling, or attempted ruling. Now during this time, the circumstances and dates that Vlad returned to Wallachia are uncertain. He did, however, invade Wallachia with Hungarian support between the times of April and August of 1456. Now Vladislav II died during this invasion, who was the ruler of Wallachia. So Vlad's goal in all of this was to take Wallachia by force, and on the 10th of September he sent his first letter as Voivode of Wallachia, self-proclaimed, to the burghers of Brasov. He promised to protect them in case of an Ottoman invasion of Transylvania. He also requested their assistance should a situation arise.
So I guess he's got his in here. You've got Vladislav II dying, and therefore he thinks this is it, this is my time.
Exactly, and now because he believes he's taken power, he no longer needs the Ottoman Empire anymore.
Interesting.
And in the same letter, he also stated, when a man or a prince is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to. But when he is weak, a stronger one will come and do what he wants to him. This once again showed his natural authoritarian personality. It is recorded in history that thousands of people were executed at Vlad's orders during the beginning of his reign. He began a purge against the boyars who had participated in the murder of his father, Vlad Dracul, and his eldest brother Mircea, of whom he at least suspected of plotting against. Vlad had a simple goal to revolutionise the affairs of Wallachia, and he was willing to do whatever was required to achieve such a result. And at this point, we now move to where Vlad continues to send the customary tribute to the Sultan, once again playing both sides. So even though he has no allegiance to the Ottoman, by paying him, he's making sure that the Ottoman Empire don't intend to take or try to take what he's just worked hard to achieve.
So I guess he's basically hedging his bets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, after John Hunyadi's death on the 11th of August 1456, his eldest son, Ladislaus Hunyadi, became Captain General of Hungary. He accused Vlad of having no intention of remaining faithful to the King of Hungary. He also noted within a letter sent to the burghers of Brasov that he requested them to support against Vlad through his brother Dan III. However, his reign of power did not last long, as on March the 16th, 1457, Ladislaus V of Hungary had Ladislaus Hunyadi executed. The burghers returned with notice that they supported another pretender, a priest of the Romanians who called himself a prince's son. This was none other than Vlad the Monk, the illegitimate brother from Vlad Dracul. He subsequently took control of Amlas, which had customarily been held by the rulers of Wallachia in Transylvania. Now during this time, Vlad helped Stephen, who he had previously fled with, son of Bogdan II, to seize Moldavia, as I said known as Moldavia today, in June 1457. Vlad also broke into Transylvania and plundered the villages around Brasov and Sibiu. The earliest German stories about Vlad recount that he carried both men, women and children from a Saxon village to Wallachia to have them impaled for all to see.
That sounds pretty horrendous.
Yeah, so what we're going to do now is we'll take a little tangent onto impaling, just to give perspective and an understanding of what he would have done during those times.
Okay.
So, I wanted to make a quick note about impaling and the origins of it with Vlad himself. So the act of impaling is to impale someone on a metal or wooden pole, often rounded to ensure no internal organs were punctured during the process. The impaling would occur from bottom to top, often revealing the object somewhere around the neck. This was done to ensure that the unfortunate receiver would live for as long as possible before bleeding out. This could often take days, where excruciating pain would be felt throughout. This was also a way of Vlad showcasing his power and strength, while ultimately taking others' lives into his own hands.
So he did this to men, women and children? He
did this to anyone that imposed him and anyone that was associated with people that he believed imposed him.
This is horrendous because, if you've been impaled like that and they've missed all of those internal organs, like you said, it's going to take a very long time for you to eventually die.
Exactly, yeah, and this was his way of saying that their life is in his hands. And to further elicit this power, he would showcase these impalings for all to see. These could be kept anywhere around towns, at front gates, and even in where he dined. We have also seen Vlads Legacy discussed and adapted from the rise of popularity of Bram Stoker's creation of Dracula. This was deeply influenced by the life and efforts of Vlad the Impaler, being the real vampire. However, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, he chose to drink the blood of his victims through their necks. Vlad the Impaler, however, had a very different technique. Vlad instead would use buckets to collect the blood as exsanguination occurred from victim to victim, and would later dip and eat bread coated in the blood of his victims. And this was a common occurrence for Vlad. This was seen as him consuming his victims and once again showcasing power above all.
That is really quite disturbing.
It is. It's a show of him being, the ruler, the almighty one, the powerful one, and that he's capable of doing whatever he wants.
Well, I guess it shows that he's in control and the people of this town are his prey.
Exactly. Well, anyone that goes against him, if you're on his side, you're fine. If he suspects you, you were in great trouble.
Oh, that's horrendous.
So the impaling was his signature killing, and as we spoke of, he was driven enough to carry victims while still alive from villages far and wide to ensure that he could control their death and the impact of impaling throughout. And now that we've had that little segue, we'll continue on with his reign. So, I wanted to move back to the timeline of Vlad, and it is at this point that Vlad's representatives held and participated in peace negotiations with Michael Cisali and the Saxons, even after conducting such treacherous acts. According to the signed treaty and agreement, the burghers of Brasov agreed that they would expel Dan III, one of the enemies discussed, from their own town. Vlad promised that the merchants of Sibiu could trade freely, including both buying and selling of goods within Wallachia, providing that the same treatment and allowances were given to Wallachian merchants in Transylvania. Now on the 24th of January 1458, Ladislaus' younger brother, Matthias Corvinus, was elected King of Hungary. He ordered the burghers of Sibiu to keep the peace with Vlad, and on March the 3rd, it seems that at this point, Matthias has seen what constant feuds can do, and as such, wanted to keep the peace and cause as little bloodshed as possible. And it was at this point that Vlad had coined himself the lord and ruler over all of Wallachia and the duchies of Amlas and Fagaras. After creating the agreement, Vlad quickly went back on his word before year-end after refusing Saxon entry into Wallachia, forcing them to trade their goods to Wallachian merchants at border fairs. In response to this, the Saxons confiscated steel that had been purchased by a Wallachian merchant in Brasov. Vlad responded by ransacking and torturing Saxon merchants. This involved bringing them back to Wallachia, where they were burned alive and or impaled. This once again included men, women and children. In an attempt to fight back, Dan III broke into Wallachia, but Vlad defeated him and had him executed as a result around the 22nd of April 1460. Once again, Vlad began a new spree in response. He invaded southern Transylvania with the intention of destroying the suburbs of Brasov. He once again ordered the capture and impalement of anyone involved, be it men, women or children. Now we continue on with the trend where Vlad invades, demands peace, invades, demands peace, and so on. It's a way of showing that all he really cares about is power, and anyone that tries to go against him will meet their fate because of the army and the power that sit behind him. Now, the next thing that happened was Vlad demanded the expulsion or punishment of all Wallachian refugees from Brasov. At this point, no one was safe from his desire for blood and cruelty, and on the 26th of July 1460, peace was once again restored, but not before thousands had died in his wake, and this was mostly down to the fear of his heinous reign. And to finish his spree of cruelty, before his own self-proclaimed peace, on August the 24th, he invaded the region around Amlas and Fagaras to punish and torture the local inhabitants that had shown any support towards Dan III.
So when you say that there was peace, actually, there may have been peace between two separate parties, but he then went on a killing spree.
Essentially, yes, and then he said, right, now we can have peace again.
What a nice gentleman.
As we move on now, we come back to the Ottoman Empire and once again Vlad's refusal to pay the yearly tribute. Vlad was growing stronger, his armies were widening, and his desire for bloodshed captivated his need for power. This continued where it was reported that during all of the events noted above, Vlad refused to pay the tribute for 3 years. The Sultan, who was on a long expedition, soon found out about such events. He ordered Mehmed II, or the Sultan's hand, to demand that Vlad come to Constantinople. He also sent secret instructions to Hamza to capture Vlad after he crossed the Danube. Now Vlad found out about the Sultan's secret plan, and he planned accordingly in return. He captured Hamza and had him executed as a result. This sent Vlad into a rage where he ordered the Wallachian soldiers to break into the fortress of Giurgiu to capture it. He had successfully invaded a part of the Ottoman Empire while devastating the villages along the Danube along his way. Vlad stated that more than 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians had been killed at his order during the campaign. This was a staggeringly high number and is something that is documented today.
23,884 Turks and Bulgarians.
And that's from his own mouth as well. That's from one of his surviving letters.
I mean, there's almost like an arrogance here because he doesn't round up. He's, stating specifically the number 23,884. Yeah. And that's almost like he's trying to say, look at me, look at what I can do, which is, really quite worrying and quite disturbing, actually.
Well, it's the trait of a leader, isn't it? Ensuring that no one can dispute anything that you say.
Yeah. He's clearly not a very nice person at all, is he?
Not the nicest. So, having learnt of Vlad's invasion, Mehmed II raised an army of 150,000 strong. The intention was to occupy Wallachia while putting an end to Vlad. During this, the Sultan also voiced that he had granted the power and ruler of Wallachia to Vlad's brother, Radu. His purpose was only to change the ruler, not to overthrow and take control. Now Vlad, outnumbered and outmanned, had to come up with a plan. During the night of the 16th of June, he snuck into the Ottoman camp with the intention of killing the Sultan. The death of the Sultan would have caused widespread panic and unrest, shaking the foundations of the camp. But not only in the soldier camps, but throughout the Ottoman Empire as well. Now Vlad and his selected men attacked the wrong camp and were forced to retreat just before dawn.
So for someone who is obviously, hell-bent on killing everyone and taking power and killing the Sultan, I mean, to get the wrong camp, that's poor planning on his behalf.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know if he's that intent on killing everyone. I just think he doesn't value human life that much, maybe. So to him, if he needs to kill, say, 23,884 people, then in his mind that was a worthy sacrifice for his cause. It's kind of like martyrdom in a sense.
It's quite interesting though how someone so kind of vicious and violent can't really plan the correct attack though.
Yeah, I know, it's all and the thing is about this, because it happened nearly 600 years ago, lots of the details have been lost in history, lots of the documentation has been lost or damaged or disputed, and because of that there are parts to this story which are hazy, and unfortunately we may never know the true story, so it's kind of just piecing together what's available.
Fair enough. It must be difficult trying to find, like you said, all the information based on the fact that, it's word of mouth at this point in time, really, considering, documents get ruined or get lost or damaged or destroyed. So, yeah. Okay.
So, as the Ottoman army pushed onwards, they came to Targovist at the end of June. The town had been deserted of any living life. The Ottomans discovered what can only be described, in scholars' eyes, as a forest of the impaled. It is believed that thousands and thousands of bodies lay impaled and dead.
The forest of the impaled. Now that is one hell of a metaphor.
It's quite a famous term used by most scholars that sort of study this time period, as well as Vlad the Impaler.
That must have been harrowing, like extremely harrowing, to the point where you just don't know where to look, don't know what to think. That must have been awful.
Absolutely. And it is noted through an extant letter, and once again graphic warning, the Sultan's army entered into the area of the implements, which was 17 stades long and 7 stades wide. Now, as a reference point, a stade is roughly 600 feet in length, so those distances would equate to 1.93 miles long and 0.8 miles wide of impaled bodies.
That's an awful amount of people.
It's horrific, yeah. And there were large stakes there on which, as it was said, about 20,000 men, women and children had been spitted, quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. The Sultan was seized with amazement and said that it was not possible to deprive of his country a man who had done such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and its people. A man who had done such things was worth much. The rest of the Turks were dumbfounded when they saw the multitude of the men on the stakes. There were infants too affixed to their mothers on the stakes, and birds had made their nests in their entrails.
There's a couple of things here. The fact that obviously we're talking about thousands of 20,000 men, women and children, that is a vast amount of people to have to be bludgeoned basically to death and impaled on a spike. And the fact that the children were also kind of tied with their mothers, that's just horrific, really.
And that is word for word from an existing letter in today. So,
and it's really interesting how, they'd been left out there for quite a while for the birds to be making nests in their entrails. I mean, those poor people and their poor families.
And what I found interesting was, although Vlad is actively pursuing and going against the Sultan can't help but respect him just for the magnitude of his act. So it sort of shows the juxtaposition of what you'd expect to see in this case, which would be anger, resentment, and the desire to, stop the person. So, if we continue forward, as a result of this and all that had taken place before it, Vlad was imprisoned in the city of Belgrade. Before long, he was taken to Visegrad, where he was held for 14 years. Now, no documents referring to Vlad between 1462 and 1475 have been preserved, and as such, extraordinarily little is known about this portion of his life. But what they do know is in the summer of 1475, Stephen III, who fled with Vlad all those years ago, sent a letter to Matthias Corvinus asking him to send Vlad to Wallachia. Stephen wanted to secure Wallachia for a ruler who had been an enemy of the Ottoman Empire, and according to Slavic stories about Vlad, he was only released after he converted to Catholicism. Now, we move on to his third rule, and at this time, Matthias Corvinus recognised Vlad as the lawful and righteous prince of Wallachia, but he did not provide him any physical support to retake his previous rulings. While settling in the land of Pest, it is documented that Vlad had a commander executed for simply entering his home without permission.
That seems pretty severe. I mean, the fact that this is documented as well means that obviously I just don't understand why someone would have someone executed just for entering his home. But I guess he was trying to set a precedent.
Yeah, so the story was there was a commander and I think 4 other soldiers. They were looking for someone and they mistakenly took his home as the place where he was hiding. And Vlad took serious offence to that and as a result killed their commanding officer.
Oh dear.
Now Vlad subsequently bought a house in Peaks that became known as Draculas House, or Draculas House in Hungarian. And while ruling in his own mind, he was sent by Corvinus to attempt once again to lay siege to the Ottoman Empire. During this short period of time, in early 1476, he was able to capture Srebrenica and other fortresses. After much success, Stephen of Moldavia, without Vlad, would invade Wallachia on September the 6th, 1476. Shortly after Stephen of Moldavia and Vlad ceremoniously confirmed their alliance while occupying Bucharest on the 16th of November 1476. So as we're seeing, there's a continued pattern that no matter what happens, his end goal is to elicit power and control over anyone he can. So he's making his way across multiple territories while also trying to keep the Ottoman Empire at bay, while also, in his mind, being the rightful lord of Wallachia.
That's really interesting because clearly what he's doing, like you said, is just showing how much he's obsessed with power and, reputation, as well as, taking countries or areas of specific land for his own and taking advantage of the people.
Yeah, exactly. But as he wasn't given an army to protect Wallachia, he's moving with a smaller unit now. So his presence is still there and he's still a name to be feared by everyone, but he doesn't have the physical presence that he would have had years before being imprisoned. And bear in mind, by this time he's also aged 14 years, so he's not as young as he used to be. Now, while desperate to rule and eager to continue to showcase his power, Vlad the Impaler was killed in battle sometime between late December 1476 and early January 1477. Now, as with other areas of this story, there are conflicting details surrounding his actual time of death, and as it hasn't been physically documented, this is the best case estimate that scholars have been able to come up with. Now, in a letter written on the 10th of January 1477, Stephen of Moldavia wrote, "Vlad's Moldavian retinue had also been massacred." Now, retinue simply means advisors to someone important and is a word that's not typically used today. So, according to Leonardo Botta, while unconfirmed, the Ottomans cut Vlad's corpse into multiple pieces, striking the final blow and insult into someone that had challenged them for so long. And Vlad's head was reportedly sent to Mehmed II, the Sultan's right hand, as a treasure and keepsake.
I mean, would anyone want to keep a head as a keepsake?
No, but it's kind of like that time zone, isn't it, where things were very different back then. The art of war and battle was something so natural to their population that the idea or concept of having your enemy's head, probably in that sense on a stake, something that could be presented publicly, would show that you are the more powerful one, you are the righteous, you are the winner, I guess
so. It's more symbolic, really, of that person's, power and influence.
Yeah, that's a much better way of explaining it. So, the place of Vlad's burial is unknown, Given his gruesome end, one can posture that his body never received a peaceful burial. There was theories that Vlad had been laid to rest in the monastery of Snagov in Romania. However, in 1933, excavations were carried out by Dinu Rossetti that found no such evidence of a burial. However, he spoke the words. Under the tombstone attributed to Vlad, there was no tomb, only many bones and jaws of horses. So what was more likely to have happened back then is that this could have potentially been a burial site of battle.
That sounds a bit more more likely, because obviously you've got, different bones and bones of animals, and it just seems like more kind of like a mass grave.
Yeah, and I mean, and given the nature of his demise, given how violent his end was and how they mutilated his corpse, it would surprise me greatly if then they would pay the respects of burying his bones in one place. It's more on the history of battle that the bones would be scattered in a way that he could no longer have peace after death. And
also, there wouldn't be a place for people to go and, pay their weird respects for him.
Exactly. So, we've come to what is essentially now the end of episode 5 of Vlad the Impaler, a man who was dedicated to power, presence, and an unrelenting spirit which carried him through battles, causing him to commit heinous acts of murder and ultimately cost him his life. And I'll end this segment with a few quotes. Now, Vlad was a man of unheard cruelty and justice, a reputation for tyrannical justice. And in 1475, Gabriel Rangoni, the Bishop of Agar, documented stating Vlad caught rats to cut them up into pieces or stuck them on small pieces of wood because he was unable to forget his wickedness. The reports and speculations surrounding his violence span far and wide. The events spoken about during this podcast are those that have been officially documented. And as I alluded to earlier, the end of his life lays in a shroud of mystery, both on the battlefield and after he was killed in battle. And quite a violent life, to say the least.
Well, I mean, obviously, with something that's happened so far back in history, I think you've done extremely well to be able to piece together all this different information. And I thought it was really interesting, so thank you, Lee.
Yeah, and I just want to say I apologise if I've pronounced things incorrectly. Some of this is in Old Hungarian or Old Romanian, and as such, the pronunciation could be a tad off.
Well, I mean, I'm just really interested how, we've gone from Vlad the Impaler to the character of Dracula. And obviously the link there really is just, I guess, the fact that he was reportedly to dip his bread into the blood of his victims.
Yeah, so the story around Dracula is that Dracula can turn into a bat, and he lives in a coffin and he drinks blood, often through the neck by either seducing victims or bringing victims into his abode without them realising what's going to happen. And as such was adapted from the life of Vlad the Impaler, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with his victims.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through that. What have we got coming up in our next podcast?
So on our next podcast, we've got someone who probably everyone will have heard of, and that is Ted Bundy. Now, given the amount of research that was required and just the level of information that's available, be it through his live testimonial recordings or his confessions or the plethora of films and TV shows and documentaries that have been created to try and understand what went on, I've had to break it down into 2 parts. But we will be releasing both of those on Saturday.
I've heard a lot about Ted Bundy, not just from, programmes and Netflix specials, but also, from looking at, the history of serial killers in the, 70s and 80s. So it'd be really interesting to see what you can come up with him about. He already makes my skin crawl, so I'm actually not looking forward to this one.
Yeah, no, he's an incredibly violent individual, and to this day, behavioural analysts or psychologists or psychiatrists are all studying him to try and understand what makes a serial killer tick, what made him do what he did, and why he did it ultimately.
The biggest thing that really kind of concerns me about his type of character was the way that he could hide in plain sight. The fact that he looked normal, he acted, quite normal around people, and, the fact that he was actually quite good looking, and you wouldn't suspect anything from him by looking at him. And I think that's what makes me really, really worry, because you just don't know, do you? You don't know who you're speaking to. You don't know the inner demons of people, I guess. And that's what's really concerning about that particular case.
Yeah, so I guess people naturally think that because serial killers have been caught that they were stupid, but ironically sadly some of the most prolific serial killers had very high IQs, and Ted Bundy was one of those. So his ability to adapt and evolve and live within society as a normal man on the outside while hiding his inner sort of anger and violence is something that a lot of serial killers have been able to do. And there are some well-known serial killers in the past that were only caught because they handed themselves in, because they felt like they were never going to get caught. And although that wasn't the case with Ted Bundy, it just emphasizes the need to understand how someone can work and live in society and thrive in what was one of the most vicious cycles of murders that we've ever seen on this planet.
The last thing I'll say about, Ted Bundy, until we visit him in depth in the next episode, is that it absolutely broke my heart that Zac Efron had to play him in that film. I can't even remember what it was called, but... Yeah,
I didn't like that film personally. I didn't think it was a great portrayal. It was just glamorized too much, and you shouldn't be glamorizing something like that. I feel like they've taken an idea from the past and they've thought, let's make a load of money from it, without actually understanding the ramifications of what they're portraying.
True, but I found it quite interesting from someone that didn't know so much about it, and also I'm devastated because I can never look at Zac Efron in the same way ever again.
And yeah, so that will come on Saturday, and that pretty much wraps up episode 5 of the Uncovering History podcast.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening again. We really do appreciate it. And Lee, brilliant research. I really enjoyed today. And I've learned so much about one of the key figures in literary history, Dracula versus Vlad the Impaler.
and as always, if you do have any suggestions or you'd like to get in touch, you can contact us at uncoveringhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And in the last couple of days, we've also launched our website, which you can find us at uncoveringhistory.co.uk.
You can also have a look at what we're up to on Instagram as well. And you can find us at Uncovering History Podcast. And so if you have any questions or you want to contribute anything or give us some ideas of what we can research next time, then please do leave a comment.
And that's all from us. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.